So, there was a lot of conversation around it, but I've always maintained that the percentage of people who are actually contributing to that about 5 lakh crores of taxation, the Indian individual taxpayer. So there's not so much of a scope, and within that, about 90% of the income earners are below 10 lakhs. So technically, we still had up to 5 lakhs which was tax free because of the 87A rebate that was available, right? So there was nothing extraordinary. Now, if you give a little bit more there, then you start losing revenue, which you can't obviously do. So what do you then do? Then you start looking at other avenues of taxation. So, for example, all these custom duties that we are talking about, electronics, luxuries, cars, accessories, everything which has got a high ticket has gone up. So the government is trying to get revenue from there. And like Mayur was talking, the surcharge, so that's going to get there. So in some sense, I don't feel that's a, I mean, one may think that the rich have to pay money, but think about it, if the rich actually have more surplus in hand, maybe they will go and invest in 25 startups, and maybe that sort of augments the government's ideology of, promoting startups. And you need to have capital free. And I would have liked to see that the tax base is itself expanding.
Yes.
So we don't seem to be expanding from there. On the other side, filing of returns, etc., which everybody now pretty much has to do. So we had more taxpayers and lesser filers. There was a little bit of a discrepancy there, which means now the government is trying to say whoever was doing a fair amount of transaction but did not need to report also now needs to report. Foreign travel. So we're going back to that 1/6 kind of a scheme where if you did any of these things, you had to file returns. So now practically, who does not have an electricity bill of more than 1 lakh a year?
Yes.
Especially in larger cities and people who are paying taxes. So that means everybody has to now come back into tax paying. So I think somewhere the government needs to also appreciate that, lesser tax means also more compliance. It just doesn't mean that, wherever there's money, go grab it. Long-term capital gains, grab it because the markets went up. But now for the last 2 years, the market didn't go anywhere. So the government hasn't really earned anything out of the long-term capital gain, for example.
Yes.
So that's exactly the point, right? I mean, this is great. This is like the American, tax system. So pretty much everything is given to you. You can finish off your filing in about 20 minutes. Having said that, today we have data which we can see comes largely from AS26, and what we see are TDS and salaries and professional fees, etc., which are very clearly visible. Properties purchased or bought or sold, whichever way it is, all that is visibly seen. But now what happens if there are family transactions? What happens if there are internal transactions? Yes. What happens if I've sort of given money as a loan to a friend, or what if I've got some money as a professional fee? So every time some activity is happening, there has to be some narration. Now, where will we do the narration? Would we fill up a bank form? Would we actually inform the bank? And obviously, it's the only banking is the largest area which is going to supply all this information. Somewhere it will get aggregated, and then I'll get a pre-filled sort of information for myself saying that, okay, this is what your income looks according to us, the IT department, and this is what your approximate taxation is to be. So the direction is fantastic. It just remains to be seen how this is going to be implemented and what we'll actually see when this thing materializes. And but it's a great step. There's nothing to take it away from that. But it's just that we'll have to probably do a lot of manual overrides is what I'm imagining, right? So we've seen that historically also happen. Everything has happened in the last decade or so. We've seen gold going to a high, then it fell down. A lot of people realized this is not the best thing to do. Gold will not perpetually keep going up. On the other side, there have been gold bonds. There have been all sorts of initiatives of the government. Yes, the announcement is large and clear. The underlying message is clear that stop buying gold, maybe do some interesting things, and as a result of which, diversify and go somewhere else, but don't really hoard that gold, because otherwise it doesn't come out, and a lot of cash flow and a lot of good precious foreign exchange of the country is locked up in that. Because every time we buy gold, the government is obviously importing it. So that's obviously happening on one side, but also I see this as a measure which is like a low-hanging fruit. Where do I get the revenue from, right? In the beginning, I mentioned that. So where do we get the revenue from? So revenue comes from cigarettes, it comes from electronics, it comes from, increasing custom duty on precious metals. And these are ways by which revenue sort of goes up. And if I may just take a little departure to again go back to revenue generation for the government, talking about that. Even the CPSC get into ELSS and becoming an ELSS and getting into 80C, which is fine. It's very crowded, but going and giving a tax incentive to consumers at large for funding a divestment program, I don't think is the best idea, because most of these public sector enterprises have been run in a particular fashion for decades, and they have not been the best wealth creators for a very, very long time. So to a certain extent, it also causes a lot of confusion because some may think that, this is government-owned company, so let me go and invest in that. And 5 years later, they'll realize, well, the NAV hasn't really moved much. So I think this was not such a great move. But I think the government has its own agenda where it's trying to generate revenue. So yes, they're trying to wean people off gold and not have them buy, but also this is a revenue-generating mechanism, perhaps for them to sort of, shore up the revenue for the government and, so that they can have their income and expenditure.